Every once in a while, I get a little burned out on doing web development, and I try to learn something new. And the thing that I've been learning recently is how to build out a game. More specifically, I'm trying to build a multiplayer game in Unity with a couple of friends back from high school. So I want to kind of give you a walkthrough of all the things I've learned. I think I've been playing around with this for like 2 weeks or so. And there's a lot that kind of goes into it. And I will say that using a engine such as Unity is actually going to be a lot faster and easier than building your own game engine, which I did on my channel in the past. I think like last year, I was trying to build like a 2D game. But one of my friends is big into 3D modeling, so we decided to go with Unity because I do think it's much easier to build a 3D game using Unity or Unreal than it is to like build your own. So I guess I'll give you a walkthrough of the game right now. It's still a prototype. We're still trying to figure stuff out. But in Unity, you have your scene editor, which allows you to kind of like walk around your game. And then you can actually switch to your game mode, which if you have stuff set up correctly, you can actually like play the game a little bit. And then you have the ability to actually click the play button, which will kick off all your scripts and all of your multiplayer assets and whatnot. Let's just click play. I'll give you a walkthrough, and then I'll kind of tell you some of the most important things I've learned using Unity over the past 2 weeks. So I do have this set up as a multiplayer game, so you can actually start a new server, and then other people can connect to it using an IP address. That's completely built in using like the netcode stuff that's built into Unity. So I'm going to click start host. And the way the game works right now is that there's two teams. So there's like a human side and a necromancer side. And the goal is the humans need to go and capture control points, and the necromancers are trying to capture those control points. So it's just basically like a capture the control point type of game for right now. There's a lot of things I'm kind of doing in this game. Like I'm using like a retro 3D shader. I'm using a CRT post-process over the camera to kind of give it that CRT look. But you can walk around right now. We can jump. Yes, the sound effects are me as well, using this microphone. So you can jump as a human, you have the gun, it's pretty loud. I need to turn that down. And I also at one point had it so when you walk over different textures, like the grass, it would play a different grass footstep sound versus if you step on the rock or the road, it would play a different sound. That's not working now, I don't know what I did. But this whole level that you're looking at, I basically built this up using just a bunch of primitive blocks. You can see we just have giant rectangle cubes. And then we have like just flat planes for the grass, and for the road, I think it's like a really, really thin cube. We got some models here that my friends made. So we got a nice little radio tower that was made by them, and the office building. These trees were made by my friend as well. A lot of these assets were found online. So for example, this zombie asset, this is something I found for free, and I just kind of clicked and dragged it into the project. I'll kind of talk about that in animations when I get around to it. But when the zombie gets close, it'll actually swipe at you, and then it will hurt the player if he hits you. We got the little graveyard. This is where the necromancer spawns. And then the point of the necromancer is they can kind of run around the map and spawn zombies to attack the players. And also they can attack the players directly. Go ahead and just walk up this little mountain area. We got a nice little water tower. We got some tree section. We got a little collapsed tunnel over there. So that's me spawning as a human player. I am going to go to the game logic, and I'm going to go ahead and just swap this to true so we can see us spawning as the other person. Now, one thing in Unity, when you change your C# scripts and save it, and when you come back to Unity, it seems to have to recompile and reload them. And then when it's done, you can relaunch your game, and the game scripts basically get ran with your modifications. So I'm going to go ahead and start the game. And here we are. So now I'm spawning as a necromancer in this little graveyard area. And the main difference with him is that he can actually leap. So he can leap fast at the players. And I'm going to change the AK to an actual like hands, because I want him to be able to swipe at players, not shoot at them. All right, that is about all we have. So let me give you an overview. If you're interested in learning about Unity and game design and game development, maybe some of the things I'll talk about right now can be useful. So you can kind of get like a crash course of how to start navigating Unity. So the first important thing to talk about is the scene editor. This is where you can navigate your map or your level, and drop models and change the models and edit them, whatnot. So the first thing you should learn is if you hold down the right mouse button, you can actually fly around the map. And if you hold down shift, you'll go even faster. So this is kind of similar to just playing any type of first-person shooter game where you use your mouse to look around. I'm using a trackpad, so it is a little bit more challenging, but this is how I typically get around. But also another great way to get around is you can click on an object and just press F. And that'll take you over to it, right? So if I wanted to go to a certain area, just pressing F will take you to it. And I think there's also a bunch of other shortcuts I need to learn along the way to become more efficient at using the scene editor. But let's give you an example of adding new things to the game. So for example, let's say I wanted to modify this farm area. Let's just go ahead and zoom over to it. And let's say I wanted to add a model here. So we're going to go over here and just find a model of the comm station. So if I click and drag this is your asset browser. So like I have all my models and my materials and my textures and my sounds over here in the project directory. And once you find a model, if you click on it, you'll see that this is like the model icon, I believe, and you'll see over here just kind of shows you some stuff about the model. You can just click and drag this into your scene, and now you actually have the model directly where you dragged it. Some of the important things about this is once you have a model in the scene, there's a couple of shortcuts I want to talk about. So W is how you can position it. So if you want to drag it up or down, press W and you get these different axes that you can drag. There's X, Z, and Y. I think Y goes up and down, and then X would be the red, and then Z would be the blue. So if you ever need to position something, you can do it like that. You can also click on these planes. If you see right here, there's like a green plane. You can do that to drag it along a locked 2 axes. So if I just want to keep it the X and Z, you can do that. So when you're building out levels, learning how to quickly drag stuff in, move it around, and then you can rotate. So if you press E, that allows you to rotate the object on different axes as well. Very important. And then R is for scaling it. So if you want it to be bigger, you can press R, click on the center, and then you can like scale it down if you want to. So those are the main 3 things that you're going to need when you're like designing your level and placing stuff. Like if you want to rotate this house a little bit, you can do that. All right, so let's move on to some other really important stuff. So like, let's add that model back. And sometimes when you're building on a game, you want to create something called a prefab. So for example, these clusters of trees, these are prefabs. So it's a prefab is like a collection of things that you want to group together so you can copy and paste it throughout your game. Also the corn, I think the corn is part of a prefab. So if you look over here, we have all these different corn stalks. They are individual, but I placed like a group of this many and then I converted it to a prefab. And the way you can do that, let me show you here. I'm going to copy this and paste it. So we'll get like 2 or 3 of these. And then we're going to go ahead and select them all. Now the way I like to create a prefab, I just literally go over here and say create a new empty object like this. I know there's probably a faster way to do this. And then I'll click on the 3 objects and I'll just put them in a game object. And then I'll probably just like rename this to like tower or something. Towers. And then what you can do is in your prefabs folder, just click and drag this whole thing into that directory. And now you have a prefab. So I can delete this and then I can click and drag that prefab anywhere in my game. Okay, so what this allows you to do is you can now edit the prefab directly, which then you can scale up or rotate one of these things. So I'm going to scale this one up and I'll go back to the game and notice that all of the places that we're using that prefab, you'll see that one comms tower basically scaled up. Okay, so very important if you want to like get quick at building out a bunch of levels and zones and you want to reuse the different things. So moving on from the prefabs, I think another thing to talk about is how I built out like the cubes that outline the border of the map. So what you could do is there should be a shortcut for doing it. I think you can say game object and I'm going to say create a 3D object. I'll say cube. And that's going to put a cube somewhere on the screen. I'm going to scale it up a little bit so we can see it. Okay, so we got a cube. Move it up and let's zoom into it. One thing that's important to learn is if you actually have an object selected, you can quickly move it around to anywhere in your camera by just doing a Command-Shift-F, and then that'll move it with your actual camera orientation. Now it does get rotated because it is based on your camera angle. I don't know the shortcut to like not do that, so I usually just zero out the rotation over here if I need to. But now we have a cube. And when you have a cube, what you can do is you can actually start applying materials to it. So if you wanted to like add a cool texture to this, you can go over here and create a new material, just call it like testing. And once you have a material, you can change the shader. So I have a retro shader that I bought for like 15 bucks that allows you to add like a nice retro feel to your textures. So we're going to go ahead and just set it to retro. And then once you have that, typically there's like a base texture that you can use. So a texture is basically just a PNG, right? So I can probably find some grass or something, and we'll just grab like this generic grass. And then once you have your grass texture applied to your testing material, you can simply just click and drag it onto your box. Okay, there you go. So we have this nice little box here. And then what we're going to do is I'm using my retro shader. So if I actually go to back to my material, I can change like the color depth and whatnot. Now, if you're not using the retro shader, you can actually use like the standard universal rendering pipeline shader. and that allows you to select like a base map, a metallic map, some smoothness to it. So like if you want to have like a metallic look to it, you can make it have some smoothness, a height map, a normal map. All this stuff is for like really high detailed textures. We're trying to keep this really like low poly and simple, but just keep that in mind that that is an option. Let me go back to the retro shader real quick. But obviously, like you see all these different options that you have. Like I'm not going to dive into all that. Now to make these cubes collidable, typically you have to have like a box collider or a mesh collider. Now by default, when you drag a cube in, it's going to have a box collider. This is so that your player can collide with this thing. But if you bring in a model, there are some things that you have to do to like make it collidable. So like for example, this tree trunk, it has a mesh render on it, but by default, it doesn't have a mesh collider, so I had to add that in. Typically, all these models, you can add in mesh colliders, or you can add like colliders over a certain area of your objects so that your players can't like get stuck in them or collide with them. But yeah, let's move on to the next important thing, which is lighting. So typically when you have a model or a box, you're going to want to add a little bit of lighting to it. So I'm going to go back up to the top. I'm going to add a light, and there's different options for your lighting. So directional light is like if you want to have a full map, a sun or a moonlight at a certain angle and a certain strength, that's what directional lighting's for. I can go ahead and add that in so you can kind of see, and you can see that it basically applies it over your entire game. I think you can change the angle of it too. So like if I want it to be at a certain angle, I can change it like this, and so now it's pointing down this way. So it should create your shadows and whatever else based on that angles. But we're gonna not use the directional lighting. I'm gonna go ahead and just move that in here. So point light's going to shine light all around it, so it's basically like a giant sphere of influence of how the lighting kind of works for a point light. If I were to actually add back my debugging tools, you can see a sphere around this light, and based on how close the objects are to your lighting, that's what the point light is going to light up. So if I go back and turn it to here, turn up the intensity to 10 in the range, notice that it does start lighting up like the tree and the box. So that should make sense. You can also change the color. So if you want to give like a nice red ambient or something, you can do that. Oh, I think this is hidden by my head, but let's move on to the spotlight. So let's go to general. We're going to say spotlight. And this is important because typically, like if you're building a car or a flashlight, you want to be able to have a beam of light that goes towards a direction. So we're going to go ahead and change this to like 30. And you can see here that we have a spotlight that shines in a very particular manner. And you can rotate it around if you want to, like this manually. So those are the main lightings. Now there's also, if you go to window, and you go to rendering and go to lighting, you have a lighting menu where you can go to environment, and you can actually bake lighting. So one thing I didn't talk about is real-time versus baked lighting. So if you go to this light, there you'll see a mode. And inside a mode, you can change it to real-time, mixed, or baked. Real time is basically you walk around, it's going to shine the light and recompute the shadows on your objects. But baked is going to be more performant, but it does take a lot of time to bake your textures. So like you can add a bunch of baked lighting around your map, but then you have to go and actually run some pretty intensive computation to bake the lighting into your textures of your game objects. Like, so as long as like your stuff is static, so I think there's like a static flag up here, which I could hide behind my head. If you go through and add static to your various objects that don't move, then it's going to be applied by that baked lighting. So again, this is just a quick little overview of all the things I've learned along the way. So let's move on to some other stuff. So we did, prefabs, we did objects, we did models. One thing I could talk about is the animations of the zombie. So like if I go to the zombie, I should have a zombie prefab, and then I can click it and actually start editing that zombie prefab. If I go into this prefab, it's a top level zombie parent with a nested model inside of it. And then here you'll see that we have an animator. The animator is what's used to control the different states of the animations. So if I actually just, double click on this animator, which in fact, the way you add this is you just go to add component. And this is something that's very important to learn. Like there's tons of different components that you can add to any of your game objects. So if you want a certain object to have certain properties to it, you can just add a component. Some of these are built into Unity. Other times there are custom C# scripts that you actually have to write so that you can apply various mechanics or do different things on an update when that object spawns or when it's falling in gravity or whatever. So we have this animator, and if I double click on this controller, I think there's a controller down here that you can see down here at the bottom. Actually, you can't see it. It's being occluded. Let me minimize this. Okay, so there's an animator here. And I think you can just create this by right-clicking and say create. You go to animations, you can say animation controller. So this is the controller of that. And if you double click it, it'll open it up. So the animator component points to this animation controller. And you'll see here we have a couple of animations that we can create animation states for. So like when you first start off this model, it has an idle state, but then you can create criteria to switch it from the idle state to the walk state. Okay, so you'll see here there's conditions of walking, and if it's true, and if the user is already, or the zombie is already in the idle state, it'll move it from idle to walk. And then when it's walking around the map, there's one condition that'll make it go into attack, the attack animations. So if I click on this arrow and scroll down, you'll see that we have a condition. Let me scroll it down like this, where it'll switch from the walk state to the attack state if the attacking condition is true. Now let's talk about these conditions. These are actually built into code. So like my zombie prefab has a zombie controller on it, and we have a model which allows us to basically change and trigger different animation states. You can see here we have a model.setBull of walking. So you can kind of change the state of your model based on your game logic. So for example, when the zombie is attacking, I change the state from walking to false, and then attacking becomes true. And then at a certain point, I have a trigger, because one thing I want to point out is like when the actual thing is attacking, you need to trigger it on a certain point. Let's go back to the model real quick. I want to show you what I'm talking about. So let's go here. I'm going to go to the animations. This is how you can find the animations, and then there will be a attack animation. So let's click attack here, and then we're going to turn this like this, and I'm going to press play. And notice that at a certain point, the arm gets in front of this zombie. And if I zoom it back a little bit, so at a certain point, like this is where I want it to actually hit the players. So one thing you're going to learn with animations is you can create events. So I'm going to go here to events, and you'll see I have an event created here called strike impacted. So when the animation hits that certain point, it fires off a strike impacted event. And then that is listened to by my zombie controller. I think strike impacted, here it is, which basically just tells whatever weapon the zombie's holding to attack, which will then compute the closest player, and then that will attack the player. So there are some timing things you got to figure out. And the reason why I'm doing this is because sometimes you want to speed up or slow down the animations, which is a real big pain if you have to go back into your code and figure out like, okay, what's the perfect delay I need to add to the attack so that it hits at the right animation. So tying your animations into your game logic, probably a good idea. Okay, so that was a really quick overview of the animations. Again, I don't know how to do rigging. I don't know how to actually create 3D models that well or do animations. I just found this model online, and then I started playing around with the animations that were built into it, and those are the things I kind of learned. Okay, so at this point, you should have a good overview of how you can kind of traverse your levels. You can actually create different scenes. So like if your scene's getting too large, you can go down here and just create separate scenes. And I do believe that's how Unity kind of treats different levels, where you can make a separate scene for your different levels so that it doesn't have to load in like a bunch of 3D objects every single time the game loads. Oh, one thing I should talk about is the canvas. So like you'll notice here we have like this random icon and some text. Let's go to the canvas, and I want to show you how that kind of works. So I actually do need to rotate it. So in the game, there was a heads-up display where you can render out text and images. So you'll notice down here we do have this icon with 100. That's linked to the player's health. So every time the player gets hurt, it triggers this thing to kind of update with the new value. We also have a crosshair in the center, but the way the canvas works is you can add any type of like, I don't know, let's go down here. I'll right click and I'll say go to UI. You can add an image, a text. There's toggle, sliders, buttons, etc. So you can use this to build up your heads-up display. And every object in Unity, you can basically disable it at any point. So if I don't want the heads-up display to ever show, I can just go ahead and disable it, and that'll kind of go away. But you can achieve that with like basically any of your game objects, right? I will dive into the scripting in just a second, but the last thing I want to show you, which is pretty cool in Unity, is when the game is actually running, you can modify the objects when the game is running. So I'm going to play the game real quick, and I'm going to host a game. And now that the game is running, one thing I can do is I can find the player who's in the game. So I should find player clone. And then if I wanted to change and tweak around like, okay, how far can they jump? You'll see over here we have a bunch of things in the inspector. Like these are variables that are linked to this script, which I'm going to dive into in just a second. But for example, we got jump force. I can change this to like 20. And then now directly in my game when I jump, I go super high. Okay, so this is really good for writing your prototype and trying to figure out like what are the proper things that I'll need to make a good feeling game. So getting good at that. And then also, I don't know if there's a way to persist it after you end the game. One thing I've noticed is that like after you stop the game, it'll revert back to the original value. So yeah, I just kind of like remember what I changed, but there might be a way to just save the things that you changed. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that I haven't mentioned that would make my productivity building out this game much faster. But yeah, you can just basically modify things on the fly, which is really helpful for debugging. And then also you can modify the scene, I think, as the game is playing. So like, for example, if I go to that player, you'll see, let me go over there. I think the player's right here. So notice that the game is still running, but there's a red capsule, which I can then like modify. I think I could like move him somewhere else. And then if I go back to the game, did it get moved? I don't think it got moved. So there's some stuff I'm trying to figure out where I don't know if you can modify the game when you're playing it or not. Certain things you can modify and certain things you can't. But yeah, that's an overview of a lot of the cool stuff. So one thing I want to talk about is the scripting. So all the scripting in Unity is built using C#. So you'll see I have a bunch of C# files. And we'll just talk about like one script. I mean, we have a lot of scripts in here, but the first script that we should talk about is the player controller. And you'll see that you basically have these scripts that you create. This is a class and it extends and implements an interface. I think this might be like an abstract class or something. Okay, and in this script, you can define all of your public / private / serializable variables. So if the thing is public or serializable, then it's going to show up in your inspector over here, which then will allow you to modify it as you're playing the game. So keep that in mind. Sometimes you want to change that. Now I will say there is an order of precedence of these values. So if you set the value inside your editor, inside your scene, like for example, on the player prefab, if I were to change this to 20, that is going to take precedence over whatever value I had here. So this has kind of screwed me over a couple times where I'm like changing values here and then I go back to the game and it's like not updating. It's because the prefab is the first order of precedence. You can actually set it to undefined and then it would fall back on the thing that you have set in the C# script. But that's kind of important to understand. That's how that kind of works. Now, I do want to talk about the game objects. There's something called a mono, let's see if I can find it. It's like a mono behavior, right? And so all these things are basically scripts you can attach to game objects. And these game objects have the ability to hook into the life cycle of the game object. So like, for example, when the game object first starts, there's a function you can kind of extend to do different things when the game object is put into the game, which allows you to find other game objects. So for example, this thing can find external game objects. Actually, I don't know if that's start. I think start only allows you to grab the game objects that are related to your prefab or your component. But then there's also like an awake command. Let me see if I can find like an awake. Okay, so there's also awake. There's awake and start. Awake, I think, is different than start. Go read it. I've already forgotten like what the difference is, but one of them is only when the game object itself and all of its components are instantiated, and the other one is when like your entire game and your scene is instantiated and you can start grabbing components from your scene. So if you can't find a component, it's probably because you're just putting it in the wrong area. Now, some really important things to talk about is when your script is instantiating, you can grab other components. You'll see there's a call to get component. That'll basically look at your current component. So for example, this is the player controller. It's attached to this player top level prefab game object. I can actually grab any of these things attached to the player inside of this player script by just saying get component. So I'm saying get component rigid body. There happens to be a rigid body attached to this player game object, so I can grab it inside of the script. Now, if you want to get a component that's nested in perhaps a child, there's a get component in child weapon manager. And then if you go over here, you'll notice that we have a model. Somewhere here, there's probably a weapon manager. Is it one of these? Weapon. Okay, here it is, weapon holder. So there's a weapon manager script. So inside the player object, I was able to dive down the children to find this weapon manager script. Again, you can just say get component in child. I think there's also a get component in parent, which will go up the tree. So if I wanted to, from the weapon holder, this weapon manager script, to find something at a higher level, you can do that. And there's also like get object by tag. I think it's get component by tag, get by tag. Oh, it's called Find Game Objects with Tags. So something I didn't mention is that every game object you add, you can give it a tag, and you can also give it like a layer. The layer is more used for the cameras, so you can actually have like certain things be added to like a mask so it doesn't get rendered on the camera. And this is important for like the camera that's on the player. So like as you're running around, you do have your own player model, but you don't want that to show up when you're playing the game. So like there's a occlusion mask you can add in. I do believe the player, you know, I won't dive into that, but layers are good for like removing stuff from the camera when they shouldn't be there. But tags are for like tagging common things that you can quickly look up inside of your scripts. And then also you can look up objects by the tag, by the actual name itself. So if you have like a global thing that you want to get, I do believe you can kind of look that up. I don't remember how you get that. Is it just find game object by name or something? Maybe it's get game object. Anyway, there's a function out there where you can actually get a game object by the string that you named it with. But these are all very important to understand. All right, so let's dive in a little bit more to the script and I'll wrap up this video. So the player controller has like an update method, which is again part of the life cycle. So every game tick, this update method will be called. And you can do various things such as like right now we're making it rotate and look at where your mouse position is. We have some jump logic added in here. We have attack logic. So like we have this input system, which we're listening for inputs. I am using the latest input system. One thing I found with Unity that's kind of confusing is that there's a lot of different versions of Unity and they all use different like rendering pipelines, different input systems. So when you're trying to read tutorials and like ask AI for help, you need to be very specific and say, hey, I'm using Unity 6. I'm using the latest input system. I'm using the universal rendering pipeline so that all the examples it gives you are hopefully correct. But yeah, there's like a ton of stuff. I'm not going to talk about all this stuff. I mean, like here's like, for example, the camera, the calling mask to remove the camera from being, or remove the player from rendering its own player on the camera. We got some input systems. So when the user attacks or jumps or sprints, which I guess I could kind of show you. I'm going to go and show you the input system. So over here, we have like this built-in input system. This is just built into Unity, but out of the box, you have like all these different things, these actions that are listening to your keyboard. So like, for example, attack is bound to your left button click. Moving is bound to WASD. And by default, you can just listen to this, I think, assuming your project is set up to use the latest input system. And then you can just basically get the player input component, which I'm guessing is set here. So there's a player input, and I think that's bound to that input system that I talked about. So over here, it's this, you do have to set it to a certain input system. And once you have that, you can then start listening for different inputs. And then you can basically check to see if the input was turned on or off. And once it's there, you can then like fire or whatnot. Yeah, so I guess one more thing I'll talk about, because I have been rambling for almost 30 minutes now, is audio. So one thing you do want to end up doing is playing some noises. For example, when we jump, there is an audio source attached to this player. So if we go back to the player, you should see an audio source down here. This allows you to basically play clips at a certain location in your game so that everyone who's near the player can hear it. So it's kind of like 3D spatial audio. Over here, audio source, play, one shot, leap sound. Okay, also you can play the human jump sound or the necro jump sound. There's also a play for when I fire my gun right here. So play the clip. That's kind of how the audio works. And for all the clips that are playing, I basically have those as public variables that you can just overwrite while you're playing the game, or like you can change them and swap them out. So like, for example, if I go and find all my MP3s, let me go to jump. You can just click and drag these and swap out the sounds whenever you want. Now, the things I use for editing sounds, I use Audacity. So like I'll find a sound or I'll record me doing something on a microphone and I'll come into Audacity and modulate it, change the pitch, change the speed, edit it a little bit, and I'll export that and put it as an MP3 into my project. For the 3D objects, we've been using Blender. So you can actually create your meshes there and export them. You can also texture in Blender as well and export the textures. But a lot of the assets I found online for like this water tower was free. I think I found it on like Sketchfab, or maybe it's called like fab.com. Unity also has like an asset store that you can actually find assets at. I will say it is a little bit challenging to find free assets. Like often I have to keep dragging models in. They don't seem like they're rendered properly, and then I go find a different one. A lot of them have certain licenses on them that you have to be careful about. But yeah, you can find a bunch of 3D models free online that you can probably use. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I should talk about. I think that's a good overview of all the things I've learned with Unity. I know it was a lot, and I know I didn't go into really much detail when it comes to like the scripting side of things. But the point of this video was to give you an overview. If you want to dive into Unity and maybe play around the game design or game development, I do think using Unity as a framework or a engine is really good. I will say we were able to build quite a lot in a very little amount of time, and I learned quite a lot by using AI to just help me through understanding Unity. Claude as well can help answer questions with Unity, so definitely use that. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Have a good day, and happy coding.